The noon sun burned over the small frontier town, turning the dust on the main road into a soft golden cloud. Wagons creaked, horses neighed, and men in hats gathered near the wooden platform where the auctioneer's voice rang out. It was not cattle or tools being sold that day, it was people. The war had left many broken families and desperate lives, and some were forced to trade freedom for a meal or a roof. Among the crowd stood a tall Apache man named Tahan. His skin was bronze from the desert wind, his eyes calm but sharp, and his long black hair tied behind him. Most townsfolk moved away when he walked by. They whispered, calling him savage, murderer, thief, but Tahan paid them no attention. He came for a reason. He needed a worker to help around his land, someone who could tend the small cornfield and the horses while he hunted or trapped in the mountains. He had coins, 2 silver ones saved from trading furs, and he hoped that would be enough. The auctioneer shouted the next lot. A man in a hat pulled a trembling woman forward. She wore a ragged dress and a rough sack covered her head, hiding her face completely. The crowd murmured. Some laughed. Probably too ugly to look at, one man joked. The auctioneer lifted her arm roughly and said she could work, cook or serve if someone had the need. He began the bidding low, expecting only a few coins. No one raised their hand at first. The woman's silence and the sack made her seem like trouble or cursed. Then a voice came from the back of the crowd, steady and deep. "I'll give 2 coins," everyone turned. It was Tahan. The laughter started at once. Some men mocked him, saying he was wasting good silver. A few spat on the ground, muttering about Indians buying brides like they were cattle. But Tahan didn't flinch. He walked forward, dropped his 2 coins onto the wooden table, and met the auctioneer's stare without blinking. The auctioneer hesitated, perhaps surprised by the seriousness in Tahan's eyes. Then he shrugged, pocketed the coins, and waved his hand. "She's yours, Apache." Tahan stepped forward as the woman stood shaking. Her wrists were tied with a short rope. He cut the rope gently with his knife and spoke quietly. "You are free to walk. I will take you to food and shade." She didn't answer. She nodded once, still trembling, her hands pressed together as if afraid to move. The sack stayed on her head. The coarse cloth hid even her breath. The people around them laughed again, but Tahan didn't look back. He led her through the crowd, away from the noise, and out toward the open plain where his horse waited. The road stretched long and hot before them. The wind carried the dry smell of sage and dust. Tahan helped her climb onto the horse and took the reins. They rode slowly, the town fading behind them until only the sound of hooves and wind remained. He tried to speak a few words, asking her if she wanted water, but she gave no answer. Perhaps she didn't understand his language, or perhaps she was too frightened to talk. Her shoulders were small and her clothes hung loose as if she had lost weight from hunger. Tahan felt a quiet ache inside. He had seen too many people broken by cruelty, both his own people and the settlers alike. As the sun began to set, he guided the horse to a small stream. The air cooled and he stopped to rest. The woman sat still, her hands folded in her lap, the sack still covering her face. Tahan knelt by the stream, filled a tin cup, and held it out. "Drink," he said softly. For a long moment she didn't move. Then carefully she reached out, her fingers brushing the cup. She lifted it under the sack and drank slowly, as if uncertain if it was allowed. When she finished, she whispered something too faint for him to hear. It was the first sound she had made since he bought her. He nodded, understanding that she needed rest. He gathered wood and lit a small fire. The orange light flickered against the rocks and her still figure. He placed a blanket near the fire and motioned that she could sleep there. Then he sat across from her, silent, staring at the flames. Tahan thought about the way the world had changed. Once his people roamed freely across the plains and rivers. Now fences cut the land, towns grew like weeds, and old ways faded. Yet even among settlers he had found kindness before. An old trader who had given him work, a widow who had shared bread during a storm. He believed not all people were cruel, just lost. The woman on the other side of the fire turned her head slightly, perhaps watching him through the sack's holes. He wondered if she thought he would harm her. The thought pained him. He had never laid hand on anyone in anger except to defend himself. When the fire burned low, Tahan lay back on the ground, one arm behind his head, looking at the stars. The sky above the desert was wide and endless. The sound of the stream mixed with the gentle rustle of dry grass. He closed his eyes but couldn't sleep. There was something about this woman, something quiet but heavy, as if she carried a story too sad to tell. Near midnight he heard soft sobs. They came from where she lay. Not loud, but enough to make him sit up. He didn't move closer. He just listened. The sound tore through the stillness like a broken bird calling in the dark. He wanted to tell her that she was safe, that he would not harm her, but he knew words might scare her more. So he added another log to the fire and sat awake until the sobbing stopped. When dawn came, Tahan saddled the horse again. The woman stood near the stream washing her hands. He noticed she had untied the bottom of the sack slightly to breathe easier. The morning light touched her small figure, and for the first time he saw her posture, straight-backed, graceful, almost careful in each movement. Not like a slave or servant, they rode through the desert until noon. The road curved between red cliffs and cactus fields. Every few miles, Tahan offered her food, dried meat, cornbread, a flask of water. She accepted quietly, always keeping her face hidden. By late afternoon, they reached Tahan's land, a small valley surrounded by hills with a cabin made of wood and stone beside a field of corn. A river ran nearby and 2 horses grazed under a mesquite tree. The woman turned her head as if surprised by the peaceful sight. "This is my home," Tahan said. "You may rest here." He dismounted first, then helped her down gently. Her hands were thin and cold. He felt the tremor in them. He guided her toward the cabin and opened the door. Inside was simple, just a table, a bed, a clay stove, and a few furs. He motioned for her to sit while he fetched water. She sat quietly, clutching the edge of the table. Her breathing was slow but steady. When he returned, he placed a bowl of soup in front of her. She hesitated again, but then lifted it under the sack and took small sips. As he watched, Tahan wondered what kind of life she had before the auction. Was she taken from her home?
Did someone sell her?
Or was she hiding from something worse? He didn't know, but one thing was clear. She was not meant to be there, sold like an object. That night, as the crickets sang outside, Tahan stepped out to the porch. The stars were bright and the wind carried the scent of sagebrush. He looked at the 2 coins he had used, his only savings. For a moment he wondered if fate had led him to that auction for a reason. Inside, the woman sat near the fire, still wearing the sack. She watched him silently, her fingers playing with the edge of the fabric. He could see hesitation in her movements, like someone waiting to know if they could finally breathe freely. Tahan said softly, "You are safe here. You can take rest. No one will hurt you." The woman didn't speak, but he saw her shoulders relax slightly. It was enough for now. Outside, the wind swept across the desert, whispering through the grass. Tahan knew tomorrow would bring questions about who she was, what had happened, and what kind of future awaited them both. But tonight there was only quiet understanding between 2 souls who had met by chance in a world full of cruelty, and found a small corner of peace. The morning sun rose soft and warm over the hills, painting the desert in golden light. The woman with the sack over her head sat quietly outside the cabin, listening to the sounds around her. Birds calling, wind brushing through the grass, and the faint noise of Tahan working near the horses. She had not spoken a single word since they left the town. Every sound still made her flinch a little, as if she expected someone to shout or strike her. But none of that happened here. Tahan worked silently, and his silence was strangely peaceful. He brought her a small bowl of porridge and placed it near her feet. "Eat," he said simply. His tone was calm, neither commanding nor gentle, just plain truth. She hesitated, then nodded slightly and lifted the sack enough to take a bite. He didn't look at her face, though curiosity itched at the edge of his thoughts. It wasn't her appearance that mattered now, he told himself, but the reason behind her silence. After breakfast, Tahan began his daily chores. He repaired the fence near the cornfield and fetched water from the stream. The woman followed him at a distance, holding her shawl close. She seemed lost, unsure what to do, yet unwilling to sit idle. He watched her gather small sticks, perhaps to help with the fire. It was a small gesture, but it told him something. She wasn't lazy or broken. She just didn't know where she stood in this new life. By noon, the air grew hot. Tahan led his horse to the shade and wiped his forehead. The woman stood nearby, quiet as ever. Finally, he spoke. "What is your name?" There was no answer. He tried again, slower this time. "Name, what should I call you?" She shifted her weight as if deciding whether to speak. Her hands trembled slightly. Then from beneath the sack came a soft voice. Eve. It was short, almost a whisper. He nodded. Eve, he repeated. The sound of her name felt strange, but right in the stillness of the desert. She looked at him briefly through the cloth, and he caught a glint of blue eyes before she lowered her head again. From that day, a quiet rhythm began between them. Tahan worked the fields, hunted rabbits, fixed tools, and checked the traps near the hills. Eve helped with small tasks, washing clothes, sweeping the floor, bringing wood for the stove. They spoke little, yet something like understanding began to grow between them. When he offered food, she accepted without fear. When he passed close, she didn't step away as quickly as before. At night, they sat by the fire. He told stories about the mountains, the stars, and the animals that roamed freely before fences came. She listened, her head tilted slightly, her hands clasped together. Sometimes he thought she smiled behind the sack, though he couldn't be sure. One evening, Tahan noticed she was limping slightly while carrying a bucket. He took it from her and placed it aside. Sit, he said. She froze, uncertain. He pointed to a rock by the fire. Sit, rest. She obeyed slowly. Her ankle was swollen, likely from walking too long in tight shoes during her capture or sale. Without a word, he brought a bowl of cool water and a clean cloth. She stiffened when he knelt to wash the dirt from her ankle, but he spoke softly. I mean no harm. He cleaned the wound carefully and wrapped it in cloth. She watched him the entire time, her breathing uneven. When he finished, he stepped back and said, Better, she whispered. Thank you. It was only 2 words, but to Tahan, it was more than any coin or gift he had ever received. It was trust beginning to form, fragile but real. The following days were easier. Eve began humming softly while she worked, a habit she didn't notice herself. Her voice was low but sweet, like wind through tall grass. Tahan often paused his work to listen. She didn't remove the sack, not yet. But her body moved with more confidence now. The fear that once made her small and stiff was fading. One afternoon, dark clouds rolled across the sky. A storm was coming. Tahan rushed to bring in the horses while Eve gathered blankets and covered the windows. Rain began to fall, heavy and cold. Thunder shook the valley. She gasped at the sound and ran to the corner, her hands over her ears. He quickly went to her side. It is only thunder, he said gently. It cannot hurt you. She trembled but nodded. The rain poured harder, washing the dust away. They stood close, watching through the cracks as lightning flashed in the distance. For a moment their eyes met through the fabric. He saw fear but also trust beginning to bloom. The storm passed after an hour, leaving the earth smelling of wet clay and life. That night, Eve sat near the fire again, holding one of his blankets around her shoulders. Her voice came quietly. You saved me. Tahan looked up from carving a wooden spoon. No, I only bought what others ignored. She shook her head under the sack. They would have hurt me, or worse. You didn't. He didn't know how to answer that. His people had suffered the same at the hands of others. He knew what cruelty looked like and had sworn long ago never to return it to anyone. No one deserves to be treated like a thing, he said finally. After that night, she spoke more. Small words at first, asking for water, pointing at things she didn't know the name for. Tahan began teaching her Apache words and she taught him English in return. They laughed softly when one of them mispronounced something. For the first time in many months, laughter touched the cabin walls. One morning, Tahan found her sitting by the stream, her hands folded in her lap. She had washed her dress and laid it over a rock to dry. The sack still covered her head, but it was cleaner now, less torn. He stood nearby, watching the sunlight dance on the water. She noticed him and said, You don't ask why I wear this. He paused, then replied, When you wish to tell, you will. She turned her face slightly toward him. You are different. Different? He asked. Kind, she said softly. He didn't know how to answer. The world had not called him kind before. They called him many things, wild, savage, unwanted. But kindness was a word he had not heard from anyone's lips for a long time. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, they shared bread and stew. Eve sat quietly, and after a long silence she said, The man who sold me, he said I was cursed, that no man would want to see my face. That's why they covered me. Her voice shook, and everyone believed him. Tahan listened, his heart heavy. He wanted to ask more, but he saw tears slipping beneath the sack. So he simply said, In my land no face is cursed. Only hearts can be cruel. She lowered her head, and though he couldn't see her expression, he felt the change in the air. Something inside her was softening, beginning to heal. As night deepened, they both sat watching the stars. Eve whispered, "Maybe someday I'll show you." He nodded. "When the time feels right." In that quiet valley, surrounded by moonlight and the sound of crickets, two lives, one marked by loss, the other by loneliness, began to find meaning in each other's silence. They had not spoken of love nor of destiny, but something gentle and unspoken had already begun, like a seed waiting for the rain. And though Tahan still didn't know what awaited him beneath that sack, he sensed that the truth, when revealed, would change both of their lives forever. The next morning began quietly. The desert was cool and the mist hung low over the ground. Eve stood near the small window, watching Tahan prepare his horse. He was loading the saddle with tools and rope, ready to ride into the valley for trading. She wanted to help, but he told her to rest her leg a few more days. Her ankle had healed a little, yet he noticed she still limped when she walked. "I will be gone until sunset," he said. "There is food by the stove and water in the jar. You will be safe here." Eve nodded, her voice small. "You always say safe." "You think I don't believe you?" He smiled faintly. "I think you tried to." When he rode off, the cabin felt empty. The silence pressed around her like a blanket. For the first time since coming there, she felt curious instead of afraid. She walked slowly through the small home, touching the carved wooden tools, the furs on the wall, and the painted feathers hanging near the door. Everything seemed carefully kept, simple but full of meaning. She began cleaning, folding the blanket he had given her and washing the cups by the stream. As she worked, she thought about his words from the night before. "No face is cursed, only hearts can be cruel." Those words stayed in her mind, echoing with warmth she had almost forgotten existed. When noon came, she stepped outside to gather wood. The valley was quiet except for the sound of insects. She paused by the water and looked at her reflection, though the sack still covered her head. The sight made her heart ache. For months she had been forced to hide, told that her face brought bad luck and disgust. She had believed it once. Now she wasn't so sure. She dipped her hands into the stream and let the cold water run over them. The wind lifted her dress slightly, and the smell of wildflowers from the hills filled the air. She felt alive again, weak but alive. As the day wore on, dark clouds began to gather on the horizon. She hurried back to the cabin, worried that rain would ruin the small pile of firewood. She was stacking the last pieces when she heard a noise outside, the sound of horses. Not one, but several. Her heart raced. Tahan wasn't supposed to be back yet. Through the crack in the wall, she saw 3 men riding toward the cabin. Their clothes were dusty, their faces rough and unkind. They looked like traders or drifters. One of them shouted, "Hey, someone's here." Eve's breath caught. She backed away from the door, her heart thumping loudly in her chest. The men dismounted and began walking around the cabin, peering through the windows. "Looks like someone lives here," one said. "Could be that Apache we heard about." Another laughed. "Let's see what he's got." "He won't miss a few things." Eve froze. Tahan had left his rifle hanging above the door, but she didn't know how to use it. She looked around, searching for anything to defend herself with. Her eyes landed on a wooden stick near the fire. She gripped it tightly, her hands trembling. One man pushed the door open. Well, what do we have here?" They stopped when they saw her, still wearing the sack, standing silent by the fire. "Who are you?" one asked, stepping closer. "Why you hiding your face?" Eve didn't speak. She kept her head down, clutching the stick tighter. The men laughed at her silence. "Must be his servant," another said. "Or his woman." "Poor thing." The first man reached for the clay pot on the table. "Let's take what we can. He won't stop us." Before he could touch it, a voice came from behind them. "I would not do that." Tahan stood in the doorway, dust on his boots and eyes cold as stone. His hand rested on the knife at his belt. The men froze. For a long moment, no one moved. The tallest man sneered. "Easy, friend. We were just looking around." "Didn't mean harm." Tahan stepped forward slowly. "Then leave now." The man shrugged. "Fine, keep your things, Apache. But tell me, what's with the sack on her head? You hiding a ghost in here?" Tahan's eyes flashed. "Leave her out of your mouth." His voice was calm but carried the sharpness of a blade. The men exchanged glances. The tallest one laughed again, though uneasily. All right. We're going." They backed away, muttering curses as they mounted their horses and rode off into the hills. When they were gone, Tahan turned to Eve. She stood trembling by the table, the stick still in her hand. He spoke softly now. "You are safe." Her voice shook. They could have hurt you," he smiled faintly. "They didn't. The land watches over us." She sank into the chair, covering her face with her hands under the sack. "I was so scared," she whispered. Tahan knelt beside her. "Fear is not weakness. It means you still have something to protect." That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire while Tahan repaired the broken latch on the door. The warmth of the flames danced over his face. After a long silence, she said quietly, "When I first saw you, I thought you were like the others. I thought you would be cruel." He looked up. "Why did you think that?" "Because everyone was. They said kindness was only for those who belonged. I didn't belong anywhere." Tahan leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. "I also did not belong anywhere once. I was born between worlds, too Apache for the towns, too quiet for the tribes that fight. The wind was my only friend. But then I learned something. Belonging is not given. It is built." She let his words sink in. "Built?" "Yes, when two people share fire, water, and truth, they begin to build a place no one can take away." For a while, they both sat in silence, listening to the fire crackle. The storm outside had passed, leaving the air cool and clean. Eve reached up slowly and touched the edge of the sack. Her fingers trembled. "Tahan," she said softly, "I think it's time." He turned his head slightly but didn't speak. He didn't want to rush her. With slow, careful hands, she untied the cloth. It slipped off her head and fell to the floor. For a moment, the firelight flickered across her face and Tahan's breath caught. Her skin was pale but marked by faint scars. Small, thin lines along her temple and cheek, the kind that spoke of old pain. But her eyes, clear blue filled with quiet strength, shone brighter than the fire itself. She looked down quickly, afraid of what he might think. "Now you see," she whispered. "This is what they called cursed." Tahan didn't move for a long moment. Then quietly he said, "They were blind." She looked up, surprised. "The marks tell a story," he said. "Not of shame, but of survival. You faced what others could not. You are still here." Her eyes filled with tears. She turned her face away, but he reached out, gently touching her hand. "No one will ever cover your face again," he said softly. That night, she slept without the sack for the first time in months. The fire burned low and Tahan sat awake, watching the soft rise and fall of her breath. He thought of how fate worked in strange ways. A chance auction, 2 coins, a nameless girl, and now a bond stronger than words. The next morning, when the sun rose, she stepped outside with her hair loose in the wind. She looked toward the mountains and smiled faintly. For the first time, the world didn't seem cruel. Tahan joined her, holding 2 cups of water. They stood side by side, quiet but content. No words were needed. The desert was wide and still, yet somehow, it no longer felt empty. Somewhere deep in his heart, Tahan knew that his life had changed forever, not because he bought a bride, but because he had found someone who reminded him what humanity still meant. And Eve, once hidden and broken, had begun to find her courage again, one sunrise at a time. The days after Eve revealed her face were quiet but filled with small changes that neither of them spoke about directly. She no longer wore the sack, and the cabin felt brighter somehow. The morning sun that came through the cracks in the walls touched her hair, and she didn't hide from it anymore. She helped Tahan grind corn, carry water, and feed the horses. Her laughter came easily now, soft and real. Tahan often found himself stopping his work just to listen to it. One morning he caught her outside, standing near the stream and watching her reflection ripple in the water. Her scars were visible, yet she didn't turn away. When she saw him approach, she smiled shyly. "The river doesn't look away anymore," she said. He smiled back. "The river sees the truth. It doesn't fear what it reflects." She nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Then maybe I should learn from it." From that day, she began to walk without fear. She tied her hair back neatly, mended her dress, and even hummed while cooking. The fear that once made her flinch at every sound had begun to fade. Tahan noticed how her steps had become steady, how her voice carried warmth. She was no longer a frightened woman from the auction. She was becoming someone new, stronger each day. Tahan continued his work as usual, but something inside him was changing too. He had lived alone for years, his life simple and quiet. Now every day felt different. There was laughter in the air, warmth in the evenings, and a kind of peace that went deeper than words. He didn't say it, but he was grateful she had chosen to stay. One afternoon, Tahan decided to take her to the nearby village. She hesitated when he mentioned it. "They won't like me," she said softly. "They don't have to," he replied. "You just need to walk with your head high. You have nothing to hide." It took some convincing, but she agreed. She wore a clean dress and braided her hair carefully. When they reached the village, the people stared. Some whispered, others frowned. A few recognized Tahan and turned away, but Eve kept walking beside him, her eyes forward. They traded corn for salt, leather for grain, and when they left, she smiled proudly. "I didn't hide once," she said. He nodded. "You were brave." That evening, as the sky turned orange, they sat outside the cabin watching the light fade. Eve spoke softly, almost to herself. "When I first came here, I thought my life was over. Now I think maybe it just began." Tahan looked at her carefully. "Life has strange ways. It gives pain to test the spirit, but sometimes it gives peace through the people we least expect." She turned to him, her blue eyes meeting his. "You think peace can last?" "If we protect it, yes," he said. Over the next weeks, they built a quiet routine. Every morning, Tahan went hunting or checked the traps while Eve worked in the garden. She planted herbs near the fence, small green leaves that grew quickly under her care. She began teaching him English words for new things, and he taught her Apache songs that spoke of rivers, stars, and lost ancestors. Sometimes at night, she asked him about his past. He told her stories of his tribe, how they lived before the soldiers came, how his father taught him to ride and his mother to listen to the wind. He spoke of loss, too, the land taken, the people scattered. Eve listened with tears in her eyes. "You lost so much," she whispered. He looked at the fire and said, "Everyone loses something. But if you keep walking, you will find something else worth keeping." Her heart softened at those words. She realized Tahan had saved her not just from cruel hands, but from hopelessness itself. One day, a new sound broke their peaceful rhythm. From far across the valley came the steady drumbeat of horses. Tahan looked up from his work. "Riders," he said quietly. His expression grew serious. Eve's heart tightened. By noon, 3 soldiers appeared at the ridge, dust rising behind them. They wore blue coats, their rifles shining under the sun. Tahan went to meet them before they reached the cabin. Eve watched from the doorway, her hands trembling. The leader of the soldiers dismounted. "We're searching for missing settlers," he said sharply. "A woman taken during a raid near Red Creek. We have orders to recover any captives." Eve froze. That was her town, the one she had been taken from. The place that had once been home but no longer felt like it. Tahan kept his voice calm. "There's no captive here, only someone who was freed from cruelty." The soldier narrowed his eyes. "Is that so? Then maybe she can speak for herself." Tahan turned to look at Eve. For a moment she wanted to hide again. The fear from her past crept back into her chest. But then she remembered his words. "Walk with your head high." She took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I am the one you're looking for," she said clearly, "but I'm not a prisoner. I'm here because this man saved me when no one else would." The soldiers exchanged looks. The leader frowned. "You're saying he bought you?" Eve nodded. "Yes, but he didn't buy me to own me. He bought me to protect me." The soldiers seemed unsure. One whispered to the other, "She sounds sane enough." The leader finally sighed. "We'll report you found, miss. You can come back with us. Your father's estate has been asking for news." Her eyes lowered. "My father is gone," she said quietly. "There's nothing left for me there." Tahan stood silent, his expression unreadable. He wouldn't stop her if she wanted to leave. That was her choice. The soldier tilted his head. "You're sure you want to stay here?" Eve met Tahan's gaze. "Yes, I'm sure." The men hesitated a moment longer, then nodded. "So be it. Just know this, staying with his kind won't be easy." Eve's voice was steady. It never was easy anywhere else. When the soldiers rode away, the sound of their horses faded into the hills. Eve stood still for a long time, the wind pulling at her hair. Tahan finally spoke. "You could have gone." "I did," she said softly. "When I left my fear behind." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. The silence between them felt heavy but full of meaning. That night they ate in peace. The stars shone brightly and the sound of crickets filled the valley. Eve watched the sky and whispered, "Do you think people can start again no matter how broken they are?" Tahan looked at her. The earth breaks and heals every year. Why not people? She smiled gently. Then maybe we can start again too. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he poured her another cup of tea and said, "We already have." The days that followed were filled with quiet comfort. They fixed the roof together, tended the crops, and shared stories. Eve no longer looked over her shoulder. Her laughter filled the valley, and Tahan's eyes often softened when he heard it. Though they came from different worlds, they had built something that felt like home. The land was still harsh, and the world still cruel beyond the hills. But inside that cabin, peace lived, shy and gentle, but real. Sometimes when the wind blew softly across the plains, Eve thought she could hear the echo of that auction long ago. The shouts, the laughter, the sound of coins on wood. But now the memory no longer hurt. It was part of the road that led her here. She often whispered to herself, 2 coins bought my freedom. But in truth, she knew those 2 coins had bought Tahan's peace as well. They had saved each other. The weeks after the soldiers left passed slowly, and peace returned to the small valley. The fields grew green with corn, the horses grazed lazily by the stream, and the sound of the wind carried through the hills like a soft song. Eve and Tahan worked side by side, their hands shaping a quiet life built from nothing but trust, patience, and simple care. Each morning she woke before sunrise to start the fire. Tahan would already be outside, sharpening tools or checking the traps he set along the ridge. She liked watching him work, steady, focused, and calm as the earth itself. Sometimes he looked up and caught her watching, and they would share a small smile that needed no words. Their days were filled with work, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer heavy or uncertain. It was peaceful, like the space between 2 heartbeats. Eve often hummed while she cooked, and Tahan sometimes joined her in low, rhythmic tunes from his tribe. Their voices mixed in the air like 2 threads weaving into one pattern. One morning, Eve noticed Tahan standing by the edge of the stream, his reflection rippling in the water. He looked deep in thought. She approached quietly and asked, "What are you thinking about?" He turned to her, his expression gentle. "I was thinking about how things grow. The corn, the horses, even the land. Everything changes when it finds care." She smiled softly. "And people too?" He nodded. "Yes, people too." She looked at the field where green shoots swayed in the breeze. "Then maybe I'm growing too." Tahan said, "You are." Stronger than before. Her heart warmed at his words. She realized how far she had come, from a frightened woman with a sack over her head to someone who could walk freely, speak freely, and laugh again. The fear that once followed her like a shadow had faded, replaced by quiet strength. Later that day, while gathering wood, Eve found a small patch of wildflowers near the hillside. They were bright yellow, swaying gently in the wind. She picked a few and brought them to the cabin, placing them in a clay cup on the table. When Tahan saw them, he paused. "You brought the sun inside," he said with a small smile. "It felt too quiet," she replied. "Now it feels alive." That night they sat by the fire as the moon rose high. The air was cool and the stars shimmered like silver dust across the dark sky. Eve leaned against the wall, her eyes half closed. "I used to be afraid of the night," she said softly. "It felt endless, like it would swallow me." Tahan stirred the fire. "And now?" "Now it feels peaceful," she said, "because I know morning will come." He looked at her, the flickering firelight reflecting in his eyes. "You found your morning, Eve." She smiled faintly. "I think I found it here." For a long while they sat in silence, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft rustle of the night wind. There was no need for more words. The connection between them was deeper than anything either had known before. Days turned into weeks, and soon the harvest came. Together they worked from dawn till dusk, gathering corn, drying meat, and storing food for the winter. Eve laughed often now, her face glowing under the sun. When she grew tired, Tahan carried the heavy baskets without complaint. When he cut his hand on a blade, she wrapped it gently with a cloth, her touch soft and sure. One evening, as they finished their meal, Eve said quietly, "Do you ever think about the past?" Tahan nodded. "Sometimes. But I don't live there anymore. The past taught me how to stand, but the present teaches me how to live." She watched the firelight dance across his face. "Then maybe the past isn't a prison. Maybe it's a bridge." He met her gaze. "A bridge to where?" She smiled. To hear it was true. Everything she had suffered, the cruelty, the fear, the loss, had somehow led her to this small cabin, this quiet man, this simple life. It had led her to peace. That night, a soft rain began to fall. Eve stood in the doorway, watching the drops sparkle in the firelight. The air smelled fresh and alive. Tahan stepped beside her, holding a blanket over her shoulders. They stood together, watching the rain wash over the land. "The earth drinks the sky," Tahan said quietly. Eve looked up at him. "And what do people drink?" He smiled. "Hope." She rested her head lightly against his shoulder. "Then we have enough of that." When morning came, the world felt new again. The rain had left small puddles glistening in the sun, and the air was cool and clean. Eve walked barefoot through the wet grass, her laughter echoing across the valley. Tahan watched her from the doorway, his heart full. He had not known joy could come so quietly, without noise or promise, just the steady warmth of another soul beside his. Later that day, they rode to the old oak near the ridge. From there they could see the entire valley stretched out before them, the green fields, the river shining like silver, and the cabin that had become their home. Eve looked at it and whispered, "It's beautiful." Tahan nodded. It was empty before. Now it lives. They sat under the oak tree for a long time. She told him stories of her childhood, how she used to dream of running through meadows, how she once believed she would never see another sunrise without fear. He listened quietly, his hand resting on the ground beside her. When she finished, she asked, "Do you ever wonder why we met?" He thought for a moment. The desert has a way of bringing lost things together. Maybe we were both lost. She looked at him and said softly, "Not anymore." The wind carried her words across the hills. The world around them seemed to pause, as if listening. As the sun began to set, they rode back to the cabin. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, and the smell of stew filled the air. Eve set the table, humming a tune he had taught her in his language. He joined her, moving quietly, his heart steady and full. That night, the fire burned bright. Eve looked at Tahan and said, "Do you remember the day at the auction?" He nodded. "I remember the noise, the heat, and the sack over your head." She smiled sadly. "I was so afraid. I thought the world had ended for me." He met her eyes. Sometimes endings are only doors waiting to open. She reached across the table and took his hand gently. "You were that door, Tahan." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The firelight flickered softly, and outside the wind whispered through the trees. It was a simple moment, but to both of them, it felt like something eternal. Quiet understanding born from shared pain and unspoken gratitude. As the night deepened, Eve stepped outside to look at the stars. They shimmered above her like endless stories waiting to be told. She whispered into the sky, "2 coins. That's what they said I was worth. But those 2 coins bought me freedom, safety, and a new life." Tahan joined her, standing close enough that their shoulders touched. "2 coins bought more than that," he said. "They bought a chance for both of us to start again." She looked up at him, her eyes soft. "Then we both owe the world a debt of kindness." He nodded slowly. "And we'll pay it by living well." The wind swept across the valley, carrying the scent of wildflowers and rain. The stars burned brighter above them. In that vast silence, their hearts found peace. 2 souls that had once been broken, now whole again through simple care, courage, and faith. Years later, travelers who passed through the valley would sometimes stop by the small cabin and see an Apache man and a woman tending the fields together. They would notice the laughter that drifted from the porch and the flowers blooming near the window. And they would say the same thing, that the place felt alive, touched by something pure. But for Tahan and Eve, it was never about what others saw. It was about the life they built quietly, away from the noise of the world. It was about healing, trust, and the strange grace of fate. In the end, the man who once paid 2 coins for a bride with a sack on her head found something far greater than he had ever expected. And the woman who once thought her life was over found a reason to live again. Together they proved that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can change 2 lives forever.